The winter winds cut through the broken walls of the old cabin like invisible knives, and 12-year-old Keisha Wallace wrapped her thin arms around herself, trying to stop the shaking that had taken over her body. She sat in the corner on the dirty floor with her back pressed against the cold metal wall and her knees pulled up to her chest. The year was 2187 and humanity had built cities on Mars and mining stations on the moons of Jupiter, but none of that mattered to Keisha right now because she was alone and freezing and probably going to die in this abandoned place. Her stepmother Linda had brought her here 3 days ago. Linda had married Keisha's father 2 years after her mother died in a shuttle crash, and from the very first day Linda had made it clear that she did not want Keisha around. The comments started small at first about Keisha's dark skin and her curly hair and the way she talked. Then they got worse. Linda would forget to make dinner for Keisha or would lock her out of the house for hours saying she needed some peace and quiet. Keisha's father Gregory worked on the Titan research station near Saturn and was gone for months at a time, so he never saw what was happening. When Linda said they were going on a camping trip to Bond while Gregory was away, Keisha knew something was wrong, but she had no choice. Linda drove the hover vehicle for hours into the wilderness of New Alaska, far from any town or settlement. The snow was falling hard and the sky was gray and empty. They finally stopped at this old cabin that had been used by miners decades ago before the company switched to robots. Linda told Keisha to go inside and look around. The moment Keisha stepped through the door, Linda slammed it shut behind her. Keisha heard a click and then the sound of something being attached to the outside. She ran to the door and pushed, but it would not move. Through the small dirty window, she watched Linda walk back to the hover vehicle, without looking back even once. The vehicle lifted off the ground and disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving no tracks, because hover vehicles did not touch the ground. That was 3 days ago, and Keisha had been alone ever since. Linda had left her with nothing except a water bottle that was now empty and one protein bar that she had eaten on the first day. The cabin had no heat and no power, and the temperature outside was dropping every night. Keisha knew about hypothermia from school, and she knew the signs. Her fingers were numb and her thoughts were getting fuzzy, and she was so tired all the time. She tried to stay awake because she had read somewhere that you should not fall asleep when you are freezing, but it was getting harder. During the day, Keisha walked around the small cabin to keep her blood moving. She counted the steps. She recited multiplication tables. She went through the periodic table of elements that her mother had taught her years ago. Her mother, Amara, had been an engineer at Stellar Dynamics, and she had loved science. She used to tell Keisha that knowledge was power, and that no one could ever take it away from you. Keisha wished her mother was here now, but she was gone and had been gone for 4 years. At night, the cold was worse. Keisha would curl up in the corner and try to remember warm things. Summer days at the beach before her mother died. Hot chocolate in the kitchen. Her mother's arms around her. But the memories made her sad, and the sadness made her tired. She had cried the first day, but now she had no tears left. She just felt empty and cold and alone. On the 4th night, Keisha was drifting in and out of consciousness when she heard something. At first she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again. It was a humming sound like an engine. She tried to call out, but her voice was just a whisper. Her throat was too dry and her body was too weak. The sound got louder, and then suddenly there was a bright light outside the window. The door exploded inward in a shower of ice and broken metal. The magnetic lock that Linda had used was blown apart by some kind of cutting tool. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by bright lights from a vehicle behind him. Keisha could not see his face, but she could see that he was tall and wearing expensive cold weather gear. He stepped into the cabin and looked around until his eyes found her in the corner. The man moved quickly. He crossed the small cabin in 2 steps and knelt down beside her. His face was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and dark eyes that looked at her with concern. He touched her forehead and then her hands, and Keisha heard him curse under his breath. He stood up and spoke into a communication device on his wrist, telling someone to prepare the medical bay immediately. Then he picked Keisha up as if she weighed nothing at all and carried her out of the cabin. The wind hit her face and she saw the hover vehicle waiting just outside. It was not like the cheap model Linda had driven. This was a luxury cruiser with sleek lines and glowing panels. The man carried her up the ramp and into the warm interior where soft lights glowed and machines hummed quietly. He laid her down on a padded table, and immediately machines began to move around her. Mechanical arms extended from the wall, scanning her body with blue light. A warm blanket wrapped around her automatically, and she felt something prick her arm. Warmth began to spread through her body, and the terrible shaking started to slow down. The man stood nearby, watching the displays that showed her vital signs. Keisha tried to speak, tried to ask who he was, but her voice still would not work. The man seemed to understand. He came closer, and his expression was kind. "Rest now," he said in a gentle voice. "You are safe. My name is Victor Chen, and I am going to help you." Then the warmth and the exhaustion overcame her, and Keisha's eyes closed. For the first time in 4 days, she felt safe enough to sleep. While she slept, Victor Chen sat in the pilot's chair and examined the information from Keisha's identification chip. Every person in the colonies had one implanted at birth. It told him her name, her age, and her family situation. Father Gregory Wallace, currently stationed at Titan. Mother Amara Wallace, deceased. Legal guardian Linda Wallace, stepmother. Victor's jaw tightened as he read the details. He had not believed in coincidence for many years. He had been flying back from a business meeting when his vehicle's sensors picked up the faint heat signature. In an area that should have been completely empty, he had diverted to investigate and found the cabin and the child inside. The locked door from the outside. The isolated location. The complete lack of supplies. This was not an accident. Someone had tried to kill this child, and Victor had a very good idea who. He pulled up Linda Wallace's records and began to dig deeper. What he found made him angry. Linda had a history of complaints from neighbors about how she treated Keisha, but nothing had ever been done. There were medical records showing bruises that Linda had explained away as accidents. There were school reports noting that Keisha often came to class hungry. Victor Chen was one of the richest people in the solar system. He had built his fortune through Quantum Horizons, a company that made advanced computers and artificial intelligence systems. He had money and power and connections that most people could only dream about, and he was going to use all of it to make sure that whoever did this to Keisha would pay. But first he needed to make sure she survived. He set a course for New Seattle, where his home and his resources waited. The hover vehicle lifted smoothly into the air and accelerated, leaving the cabin and the frozen wilderness behind. Keisha woke up in a bed that felt like clouds. The room around her was bright but not harsh, with sunlight streaming through windows that seemed to stretch from floor to ceiling. She blinked slowly, trying to remember where she was and how she got here. Then it all came back to her in a rush. The cabin, the cold, the man who had saved her. Victor Chen. She sat up carefully and looked around. The room was bigger than her entire apartment back home. The walls were a soft cream color, and there were real plants in the corners, not the plastic ones that most people had. Through the window, she could see water sparkling in the distance and mountains with snow on their peaks. A door opened and a woman in a white uniform came in carrying a tray. "Good morning, dear," the woman said with a kind smile. "My name is Claire, and I am the medical assistant here. How are you feeling?" Keisha's throat was still dry, but she managed to croak out that she was okay. Claire set the tray down on a table beside the bed. There was soup and bread and juice and fruit. Real food, not the protein packets that Keisha usually ate. "Eat slowly," Claire said. "Your stomach needs to adjust. I will let Mr. Chen know you are awake." Keisha ate slowly as instructed, and the warm soup made her feel more human. Her fingers still hurt from the frostbite, but they were wrapped in some kind of medical gel that tingled slightly. She was wearing soft pajamas that were too big for her, and her hair had been washed and braided. Someone had taken care of her while she slept, and the thought made her want to cry, but she held it back. Victor Chen entered the room a few minutes later. In the daylight, Keisha could see him more clearly. He was tall and slim with gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He was wearing simple clothes, but even Keisha could tell they were expensive. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, looking at her with an expression that was serious but not unkind. "Keisha," he said. "That is your name, correct?" She nodded. "I need you to tell me what happened. I know it will be difficult, but I need to understand everything." So Keisha told him. She told him about her mother's death and how her father had married Linda. She told him about the years of cruel words and neglect. She told him about the camping trip that was not really a camping trip, and how Linda had locked her in the cabin and left her to die. As she talked, Victor's face grew darker. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, curled into fists. But he did not interrupt her. He let her tell the whole story from beginning to end. When she finished, there was silence in the room. Victor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the view for a long moment. "What Linda did to you was attempted murder," he said finally. In the colonies, such a crime carries a sentence of 20 years or more. But we need proof. We need evidence that will stand up in court. I have already started gathering information, but I need your help. Are you willing to help me make sure she pays for what she did? Keisha felt something stir inside her. It was not anger exactly, but something harder, something that said she would not let Linda get away with this. Yes, she said. I will help. Good, Victor said, turning back to face her. Rest today. Tomorrow we start working. I have hired investigators and lawyers. We will build a case that cannot be broken. And Keisha. She looked at him. You are safe here. No one will hurt you again. I promise. Over the next few days, Victor's house became a hub of activity. People came and went, bringing reports and files and holographic displays full of information. Keisha met the investigators who were digging into Linda's background. She met the lawyers who were preparing the case. She gave statements and answered questions until she was exhausted, but she never complained. This was important. This was justice. The investigators found things that made Keisha sick to her stomach. Linda had taken out life insurance policies on her worth $500,000 credits. She had been in contact with a man named Patrick Grant, who worked as a financial advisor and who had a criminal record for fraud. The messages between them talked about how much money Linda would get when Keisha died and how they could make it look like an accident. They had planned everything down to the smallest detail. Linda had purchased the magnetic lock 3 weeks before the trip using a fake identity. She had researched the area and found the cabin specifically because it was isolated and off any patrol routes. She had even checked the weather forecast to make sure there would be a storm that would cover her tracks. It was cold and calculated and evil. Keisha could not understand how someone could be so cruel. Victor also found satellite footage that Linda had tried to delete showing her hover vehicle at the cabin location. He found purchase records and communication logs and financial transactions. Every piece of evidence was documented and verified. Nothing was left to chance. When Victor finally presented the complete case to the Colonial Justice Bureau, they acted immediately. Linda Wallace was arrested at her home 5 days after Victor found Keisha. Patrick Grant was arrested an hour later. The news spread quickly through the colonies. A wealthy woman trying to murder her stepdaughter for insurance money was the kind of story that people could not stop talking about. Keisha watched the news coverage from the safety of Victor's house and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The trial was fast by legal standards. The evidence was overwhelming, and Linda's lawyers could not build any kind of defense. Linda tried to claim that Keisha had run away and that she had been searching for her, but the satellite footage proved that was a lie. She tried to say that Patrick Grant had manipulated her, but the messages showed she had been an eager participant. In the end, the jury took less than 2 hours to find her guilty. Linda Wallace was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security facility on Mars. Patrick Grant received 15 years. As the judge read the sentences, Linda looked back at Keisha, who was sitting in the courtroom with Victor. Their eyes met for a moment, and Keisha saw no remorse there. Only anger that she had been caught. Keisha looked away. Linda was not worth her time anymore. After the trial, Keisha's father, Gregory, arrived from Titan. He had been recalled immediately when the authorities contacted him about what had happened. When he walked into Victor's house and saw Keisha, he broke down. He fell to his knees and sobbed, saying he was sorry over and over. Keisha stood there not knowing what to do. She had been angry at her father for not seeing what Linda was doing, but seeing him like this made her realize he had been fooled just like everyone else. Gregory and Victor talked for hours that night. Keisha sat with them listening as the two men discussed her future. Gregory wanted to take her back home, but Victor shook his head. Your daughter is special, he said. She has gifts that should not be wasted. I want to offer her opportunities that you cannot provide. I want to send her to the best schools and give her the resources she needs to reach her full potential. Gregory looked at Keisha. What do you want, he asked. Keisha thought about it. She loved her father, but she also knew that going back to their small apartment and her old school would be going backwards. Victor was offering her a chance at something more. Something better. I want to stay here, she said quietly. I want to learn and grow and become someone who can help people. Gregory nodded slowly. His face showed pain but also understanding. Then that is what you will do, he said. The Academy of Advanced Sciences sat on an artificial island in the middle of Puget Sound, like a jewel floating on water. Keisha stood at the window of the transport shuttle looking down at the campus as they approached. The buildings were sleek and modern with solar panels and gardens on the roofs. Students walked along paths between classes carrying tablets and talking in groups. This was going to be her new school and she felt both excited and terrified. Victor sat beside her in the shuttle. He had spent the last month helping her prepare for this moment. They had gone shopping for clothes and school supplies. They had toured the campus. They had met with the administrators who had been impressed by Keisha's test scores. She was 12 years old, but she was testing at a level that was closer to 15 or 16. The academy accepted her immediately. The shuttle landed on a pad near the main building and Keisha followed Victor down the ramp. A woman was waiting for them. She was tall with dark skin and gray hair pulled back in a bun. She wore a white coat over her clothes and her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "This is Dr. Helena Rodriguez," Victor said. "She will be your primary instructor for quantum mechanics." Helena smiled and shook Keisha's hand. "Welcome to the academy," she said. "I have been looking forward to meeting you." The first few weeks were overwhelming. Keisha was placed in classes with students who were older than her and who had been studying advanced subjects for years. The lessons covered topics she had barely heard of: quantum entanglement, relativistic physics, advanced calculus. She struggled at first trying to keep up with discussions that seemed to fly over her head. But she did not give up. Every night she studied until her eyes hurt. Every morning she got up and tried again. Slowly things began to click. The patterns started to make sense. The equations that had looked like random symbols began to tell stories about how the universe worked. Keisha discovered that she had a natural talent for seeing connections that others missed. She could look at a problem and find solutions that were elegant and simple. Her teachers noticed. Her classmates noticed. Word spread that there was a new student who was something special. Helena Rodriguez took Keisha under her wing. She gave her extra assignments and recommended books to read. She invited Keisha to her lab where she was working on quantum communication networks. Keisha watched as Helena ran experiments and analyzed data, and she began to understand what it meant to be a real scientist. It was not just about knowing things. It was about asking questions and finding answers and never being satisfied with what you already knew. One evening, Helena asked Keisha to stay after class. They sat in the empty classroom as the sun set outside the windows. "You have a gift," Helena said. "I have been teaching for 20 years and I have never seen a student with your level of intuition. But gifts can be dangerous if you do not know how to use them." Keisha listened as Helena talked about the responsibility that came with intelligence. "Knowledge is power," she said, "but power without wisdom leads to destruction. Always remember why you are learning. Not to be better than others, but to help others." Those words stayed with Keisha. When the academy announced its annual project competition, she thought carefully about what she wanted to create. Many students were building impressive things: robots that could navigate complex environments, algorithms that could predict market trends, holograms that looked completely real. But Keisha remembered what Helena had said about helping others. She decided to build something that would make a real difference. The colonies on Mars were struggling with water. The planet was dry and every drop had to be recycled. The current purification systems used a lot of power and broke down frequently. Keisha designed a new system that used less energy and had fewer moving parts. It worked by using a combination of solar power and chemical filters that could be made from materials found on Mars. She built a prototype in the academy workshop, spending hours getting every detail right. When she presented her project at the competition, the judges were impressed. They asked her questions about efficiency and durability and cost. Keisha answered every question with confidence, showing them the data she had collected and the simulations she had run. Her system was not the flashiest project at the competition, but it was the most practical. It won first place, but more importantly, it got noticed by people who could actually use it. A company that built infrastructure for the Mars colonies contacted Keisha a month later. They wanted to test her design in a real settlement. Keisha worked with their engineers to modify the system and scale it up. 6 months later, the first unit was installed in a small mining town on Mars. It worked perfectly. Within a year, 3 more settlements had installed modified versions of her design. Thousands of people had clean water because of something Keisha had built when she was 13 years old. The success changed something in Keisha. She realized that she did not just want to understand science. She wanted to use science to solve real problems. She wanted to help people the way Victor had helped her. She began to think about her future differently, not just as a student but as someone who could make a real impact on the world. Victor watched her progress with pride. They had dinner together every week, and Keisha would tell him about her classes and her projects. Victor listened and asked questions and sometimes offered advice, but mostly he just let her talk. He could see that she was finding her own path, and that was exactly what he had hoped for. One evening, as they sat in his study looking out at the water, he told her something important. "When I was your age," he said, "I thought success meant making money. I worked hard and I became rich, but I was not happy. It took me years to understand that money is just a tool. What matters is what you do with it. What matters is how you treat people and how you make the world better. You already understand that at 13. That makes you wiser than I was at 30. Keisha felt warmth in her chest. Victor had given her so much. A home, an education, a future. But more than that, he had given her confidence. He believed in her, and that belief made her believe in herself. She thought about the girl who had been freezing in that cabin just a year ago. That girl had been scared and alone and convinced she was worthless. But she was not that girl anymore. She had been transformed by kindness and opportunity and her own determination. The academy years flew by. Keisha continued to excel, taking on more challenging courses and working on bigger projects. She made friends with other students who shared her passion for science. She learned not just from her teachers, but from everyone around her. By the time she was 15, she was taking university-level courses and working part-time at Quantum Horizons, helping Victor's researchers with complex problems. Her father, Gregory, visited when he could. Their relationship was complicated. He loved her and she loved him, but there was a distance between them that could not be bridged. He had failed to protect her when she needed him, and both of them knew it. But he was proud of what she had become. He would sit in Victor's study and listen as Keisha explained her latest project, and his eyes would shine with tears. "I am sorry," he would say. "I am so sorry." And Keisha would tell him it was okay, even though part of her was not sure if it really was. But she did not let the past hold her back. She focused on the future and on becoming the person she wanted to be. Someone who used their gifts to help others. Someone who never forgot where they came from, but was not defined by it. Someone who proved that no matter how dark things got, there was always hope for something better. That was the person Keisha was becoming, and she was proud of it. The breakthrough came when Keisha was 16. She was working late in the Quantum Horizons research lab, analyzing data from a deep space probe that had been exploring the outer reaches of the solar system. The probe had detected unusual energy readings near the Kuiper belt and sent back information that the computers were having trouble making sense of. Most of the senior researchers had looked at the data and dismissed it as equipment malfunction. But Keisha was not convinced. She spent 3 days running the numbers through different analysis programs. She cross-referenced the patterns with everything in the scientific databases. And then she saw it. The energy readings were not random. They followed mathematical patterns that did not occur in nature. Someone or something had created them. Keisha's hands were shaking as she saved her findings and called Victor. Victor arrived at the lab within an hour. He looked at Keisha's work with growing excitement. She had found evidence of alien technology. Not just ruins like the ones discovered on Mars decades ago, but something that was still active, still functioning, still sending out signals. Victor immediately assembled a team of the best scientists at Quantum Horizons. They spent 2 weeks analyzing the data from every possible angle. The conclusion was undeniable. Humanity had found its first working piece of xenotechnology. The colonial government was notified and they moved fast. An expedition was organized to investigate the source of the signals. Victor used his influence to ensure that Keisha was included on the science team. At 16, she would be the youngest person ever sent on a deep space mission. There were objections from some officials who said she was too young, but Victor argued that she was the one who had made the discovery. She deserved to be part of what came next. The research vessel Discovery launched 3 months later. It was a massive ship designed for long missions with living quarters for 50 people and laboratories that could conduct any experiment imaginable. Keisha had her own cabin and workspace. As the ship left Earth orbit and accelerated toward the Kuiper belt, she felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She was leaving behind everything familiar and heading into the unknown. The journey took 3 months. Keisha spent her time studying everything humanity knew about alien civilizations, which was not much. There were ruins on Mars that suggested a species had lived there millions of years ago. There were strange structures on some of Jupiter's moons, but nothing active, nothing that still worked. If the device they were searching for was functional, it would be the most important discovery in human history. The other scientists on the mission treated Keisha with respect despite her age. They had all seen her analysis and knew she was brilliant. Dr. Helena Rodriguez was also on the mission, and having her there made Keisha feel more comfortable. Helena had become like a second mentor to her, teaching her not just science but how to navigate the politics and personalities of the research world. When they finally reached the coordinates the site took everyone's breath away. Floating in space was a structure unlike anything humanity had ever built. It was made of some kind of crystal that glowed with a soft blue light. The structure was several kilometers across with geometric patterns that hurt to look at because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. The energy readings were coming from the center of the structure in pulses that were regular and rhythmic like a heartbeat. The Discovery took up position a safe distance away and launched scanning drones. The data that came back was incredible. The structure was ancient, maybe millions of years old, but it showed no signs of decay. It was generating its own power, somehow drawing energy from the quantum foam of space itself, and at its core was something that looked like a gateway, a doorway to somewhere else. Keisha worked with the team analyzing every detail. They determined that the structure was a wormhole generator, a device that could create stable tunnels through space, allowing instant travel across vast distances. The implications were staggering. If humanity could understand how it worked, they could reach distant star systems. They could explore the galaxy. The solar system would no longer be the limit of human civilization, but first they had to figure out how to activate it. The device had been dormant for who knew how long. Its creators were gone. There were no instructions, no manual, no guide. The team spent months studying the structure, sending drones to examine every centimeter. They took samples of the crystal material and tried to determine how it worked. Progress was slow and frustrating. Some scientists began to think that they would never understand it. Keisha refused to give up. She spent 16 hours a day running simulations and testing theories. She barely slept and barely ate. Victor, who had joined the mission in the second month, became worried about her health. But Keisha could not stop. She felt like the answer was just out of reach, like she was standing at the edge of understanding something profound. The breakthrough came on Keisha's 17th birthday. She was running simulations late at night when she noticed something. The energy pulses from the structure followed a pattern that matched a mathematical sequence called the Fibonacci spiral. It was a pattern that appeared throughout nature in seashells and galaxies and the arrangement of flower petals. But it was also a pattern that could be expressed as a code. A language. Keisha began translating the pulses into mathematical commands. She worked for 6 hours straight, barely aware of time passing. When she finally looked up, she had something that looked like an activation sequence. She ran it through her simulation programs and held her breath as the results came back. It worked. The simulation showed the wormhole generator coming to life and creating a stable gateway. She took her findings to the mission commander and to Victor. They reviewed her work carefully. The mathematics were sound. The logic was flawless. But actually trying it was risky. If something went wrong, the energy release could destroy the Discovery and everyone on it. They debated for hours. In the end, they decided that the potential reward was worth the risk. Humanity had not come this far to turn back now. The Discovery moved to maximum safe distance. Keisha entered the activation sequence through the communication link to the structure. Everyone held their breath as the signal was transmitted. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the blue glow of the crystal intensified. The geometric patterns began to shift and move. The space at the center of the structure rippled like water disturbed by a stone, and then it opened. A circular gateway appeared, showing a view of somewhere else. Stars that were not the stars of Earth's solar system, a planet with purple clouds. It was a window to another part of the galaxy. The wormhole was stable. It was working. Humanity had achieved faster than light travel. The Discovery erupted in cheers. People were crying and hugging each other. Keisha sat at her console staring at the screen showing the gateway. She had done it. She had solved the puzzle that the ancient aliens had left behind. At 17 years old, she had changed the course of human history. Victor came to her station and put his hand on her shoulder. He did not need to say anything. The pride in his eyes said it all. Helena Rodriguez was also there. She pulled Keisha into a hug and whispered in her ear. "Your mother would have been so proud," she said. Keisha felt tears running down her face. She thought about her mother who had taught her to love science. She thought about the cabin where she had almost died. She thought about how far she had come from that terrified freezing child to this moment standing on the bridge of a starship looking at a gateway to the stars. The news spread across the solar system at the speed of light. Keisha's name became known to billions. She was the girl who had unlocked the secrets of the aliens, the girl who had given humanity the stars. But Keisha did not care about fame. What mattered to her was that she had done something important, something that would help people. And she knew this was just the beginning. There was so much more to discover, so much more to learn. The galaxy was waiting. The years after the wormhole discovery passed in a blur of activity and change. Humanity rushed to explore the gateway that Keisha had opened, and the first expedition through the wormhole returned with news that transformed everything. There was a habitable planet on the other side with water and atmosphere and land that could support human life. Within 2 years, the first colony was established. Within 5 years, there were 10 colonies scattered across 3 star systems. Humanity was no longer confined to one solar system. The dream of the stars had become real. Keisha was at the center of it all. At 20, she held a doctorate in quantum physics and xenotechnology. She had written papers that were studied by scientists across the colonies. She had given lectures to audiences of thousands. Her face was recognized everywhere she went, but fame had never been what she wanted. What drove her was the work itself. The endless puzzle of understanding how the alien technology functioned and how it could be adapted for human use. She founded her own research institute with funding from Victor, but operating independently. The Institute for Advanced Xenotechnology Studies occupied a building in New Seattle, with laboratories and workshops, and the best equipment that money could buy. Keisha recruited the brightest minds she could find, young scientists who shared her passion for discovery. Together, they worked on projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. One of their biggest successes was developing improved wormhole generators based on the alien design. The original device was massive and required enormous amounts of energy. Keisha's team created smaller versions that could be installed on ships, allowing them to create temporary wormholes for travel. It was not perfect. The smaller generators could only maintain a wormhole for a few minutes, and they needed hours to recharge. But it was enough to revolutionize space travel. Ships equipped with the new drives could jump between star systems in days instead of years. Trade routes opened up. Communication became easier. The isolated colonies became part of a connected network. People talked about the golden age of exploration and expansion, and they knew that none of it would have been possible without Keisha Wallace, but Keisha never forgot where she came from. She thought often about that cabin and the cold and the feeling of being completely alone. She thought about all the children who were suffering right now in ways that no one could see, and she decided to do something about it. At 23, she established the Wallace Foundation using a portion of the wealth she had earned from her patents and discoveries. The foundation had one mission: to find children who were talented but disadvantaged and give them the opportunities they deserved. It operated schools in the poorer districts of the colonies. It funded scholarships for students who could not afford advanced education. It ran safe houses where children fleeing abuse could find refuge and support. Within 5 years, the foundation was helping thousands of young people across dozens of worlds. Victor watched all of this with deep satisfaction. He was 75 now, and his health was starting to fail. But he had lived long enough to see Keisha become everything he had hoped she would be. More than just a brilliant scientist, but a person who used her gifts to help others. One evening, as they sat together in his study, he told her something important. "I have been thinking about my legacy," he said. "When I die, most of my wealth will go to charitable causes. But there is something specific I want to do. I want to endow the foundation permanently. Give it enough money that it can operate forever, helping generation after generation of children. Will you accept that responsibility?" Keisha felt tears in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I will make sure it continues your work and mine." Victor died 2 years later, peacefully in his sleep. His death hit Keisha hard. He had been more than a guardian or a mentor. He had been the father figure she needed when her own father had failed her. The funeral was attended by thousands, scientists and politicians and business leaders. but also ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Victor's generosity. Keisha gave the eulogy speaking about how one person's kindness could change the world. After Victor's death, Keisha threw herself into her work with even more intensity. She led expeditions to search for more alien artifacts. Her team discovered ruins on a distant planet that contained libraries of information stored in crystal matrices. Decoding that information took years, but it revealed the history of the civilization that had built the wormhole generators. They called themselves the architects, and they had been explorers and builders just like humanity. The architects had spread across their galaxy, creating wonders. But they had also made mistakes. They had fought wars among themselves. They had destroyed entire worlds in their conflicts. Eventually, their civilization had collapsed, leaving behind only ruins and the technology they had created. It was a sobering lesson about the dangers of power without wisdom. Keisha made sure that the story of the architects was taught in schools across human space. She wanted people to learn from their mistakes. As Keisha entered her 30s, she began to think about the future in a different way. She had achieved more than she ever dreamed possible. She had fame and respect and wealth. But what would happen when she was gone? Who would carry on the work? She started looking for successors. Young scientists who showed not just brilliance but also compassion. People who understood that technology was a tool for helping others, not just a source of power or profit. One of those people was a girl named Arya. She was 13 and had grown up in the slums of a Mars colony. She had lost her parents in a mining accident and had been shuffled through foster homes where no one cared about her. But a teacher had noticed her talent for mathematics and had recommended her for a Wallace Foundation scholarship. When Keisha met Arya, she saw something of herself in the girl's eyes. The same hunger for knowledge, the same determination to prove that she mattered. Keisha took Arya under her wing just as Victor had taken Keisha. She brought her to the institute and taught her everything she knew. Arya absorbed knowledge like a sponge. Within 2 years, she was contributing to real research projects. Within 5 years, she had published her first paper. Keisha watched her grow and felt proud. The cycle was continuing, one generation helping the next. But Keisha also made time for herself. She had spent so many years focused on work that she had neglected other parts of life. She started taking vacations, traveling to the new colonies and seeing the worlds that humans were building. She reconnected with old friends from the academy. She even started dating, though relationships were complicated when you were one of the most famous people in human space. Her father, Gregory, was still alive, though his health was failing. They had rebuilt their relationship slowly over the years. It would never be what it had been before Linda, but it was something. He visited when he could, and they would talk about her mother in the old days. Gregory was proud of what Keisha had become, but he also carried guilt that he could never quite let go of. "I should have protected you," he would say. "I should have seen what Linda was doing." Keisha would tell him that she had forgiven him, but she was not sure if that was entirely true. At 35, Keisha was invited to give a keynote speech at the Colonial Science Summit. It was the most prestigious event in the scientific community, attended by the greatest minds from across human space. She stood on the stage looking out at an audience of thousands and spoke about her journey. From the cabin to the stars, she talked about the importance of giving people chances, about how one act of kindness could change a life and through that life change the world. The speech received a standing ovation that lasted 10 minutes. Afterwards, people came up to her with tears in their eyes, telling her how much her story meant to them. Some shared their own stories of overcoming hardship. Others thanked her for the work the foundation was doing. Keisha listened to each person with genuine interest. She knew that behind every successful person was usually a story of struggle and someone who had helped them when they needed it most. That night, Keisha stood alone, on the balcony of her hotel room looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there were colonies full of people living their lives, children going to school, scientists making discoveries, families building homes on new worlds, and she had played a part in making that possible, not just through her scientific work, but through her commitment to helping others. That was the real legacy. Not the papers or the patents, but the lives she had touched and improved. The decade that followed was both the most productive and most challenging of Keisha's life. At 40, she was leading 3 major research projects simultaneously, while also running the foundation and mentoring a new generation of scientists. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. Every breakthrough in understanding alien technology opened new possibilities. Every child helped through the foundation represented a life that might otherwise have been wasted. Keisha felt like she was living multiple lives at once and she would not have had it any other way. One of the biggest challenges came from an unexpected source. As humanity expanded across the galaxy, old prejudices came with them. The same racism and discrimination that had existed on Earth appeared in the colonies. Some settlements refused to accept certain groups. Some companies would not hire people based on their skin color or origin. Keisha watched this happening with growing anger. Humanity had reached the stars but had not left behind its worst impulses. She began to speak out publicly about these issues. She used her fame and influence to challenge discrimination wherever she saw it. She gave interviews talking about her own experiences with racism. She testified before the Colonial Council advocating for stronger civil rights protections. Some people criticized her, saying she should stick to science and stay out of politics. But Keisha refused to be silent. She had survived Linda's hatred, and she would not let others suffer the same way if she could prevent it. The foundation expanded its mission to include direct advocacy work. They funded legal challenges to discriminatory laws. They supported community organizations fighting for equality. They ran educational programs teaching young people about the history of racism and the importance of treating everyone with respect. It was controversial work and it made enemies. Keisha received threats. Some of her research funding was cut by organizations that disagreed with her activism. But she did not back down. Arya, who was now in her 20s, stood by Keisha through all of it. She had become a brilliant scientist in her own right, and she understood the importance of using their platform for good. Together, they wrote an open letter to the colonial government demanding reforms. Hundreds of scientists signed it. Thousands of ordinary citizens added their names. The pressure eventually forced the government to act. New laws were passed protecting people from discrimination in employment and housing. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Meanwhile, the scientific work continued. Keisha's team made a major discovery on a planet they had been studying for years. They found a complete architect city buried under ice. Unlike other ruins, this one was almost perfectly preserved. They spent 3 years excavating and documenting everything they found. The city revealed details about architect society that were both fascinating and disturbing. The architects had been divided into different groups that competed for resources and power. As their technology advanced, the conflicts became more deadly. They developed weapons that could destroy planets. They fought wars that lasted centuries. Eventually, their civilization collapsed not from external threats but from internal divisions. The parallels to human history were impossible to ignore. Keisha made sure that these findings were widely publicized. Humanity needed to learn from the architects' mistakes. One artifact they found was particularly significant. It was a kind of memory device that contained the personal records of an architect named something that translated roughly as builder. This individual had been a scientist and philosopher who had tried to warn their society about the dangers of their path. They had written extensively about the need for unity and compassion. Their writings had been ignored and they had died during one of the wars. Reading Builder's words, Keisha felt a connection across millions of years. Here was someone who had understood what truly mattered. She had Builder's writings translated and published. They became unexpectedly popular, especially among young people. The message of unity and the warning about the dangers of conflict resonated in a time when humanity was still figuring out how to live together across dozens of worlds. Some people even started a movement inspired by Builder's philosophy, advocating for peaceful cooperation and respect for all forms of life. Keisha's father, Gregory, died when she was 43. He had been sick for a while and his death was not unexpected, but it still hurt. At his funeral, Keisha spoke about the complicated relationship they had shared. He had failed her when she was young, but he had also loved her in his own flawed way. She forgave him fully, and finally understanding that people were complicated and that love and failure could exist together, she hoped he had found peace. Around the same time, Keisha learned that Linda had died in prison. She had served 18 years of her sentence before an illness took her. Keisha felt nothing when she heard the news. Not satisfaction or sadness, just emptiness. Linda had stolen years of her childhood and had tried to steal her life. But in the end, Linda had failed and Keisha had succeeded. That was enough. She did not waste energy on hatred. As Keisha approached 50, she began to think more seriously about succession planning. She would not live forever, and she wanted to make sure that both her scientific work and the foundation would continue after she was gone. She established a board of directors for the foundation, made up of people she trusted. She appointed Arya as the deputy director of her research institute. She made sure that the knowledge she had accumulated was documented and shared. But she was not ready to retire. There was still too much to do. New expeditions to lead, new artifacts to study, new technologies to develop, and most importantly, new young people to help. Every year, the foundation graduated hundreds of students who went on to successful careers in science and engineering and medicine. Some of them came back to work for the foundation or the institute. The cycle continued. One of the graduates was a young man named Carlos who had grown up in extreme poverty on a mining colony. His parents had died when he was young, and he had lived on the street surviving by his wits. A foundation outreach worker had found him and brought him into the program. Carlos had a gift for engineering, and by 25 he had designed a new type of life support system that was more efficient and reliable than anything currently in use. His invention was saving lives on ships and stations across human space. When Carlos won the Colonial Innovation Prize, he thanked the Wallace Foundation in his acceptance speech. He talked about how he would have died on those streets if someone had not given him a chance. He talked about the importance of helping those who society had forgotten. Keisha watched the speech from her office and cried. This was why she did the work. This was what mattered. Not the fame or the recognition, but knowing that lives were being saved and improved. At 50, Keisha received the highest honor in science, the Pioneer Medal, which was given to individuals who had fundamentally changed human understanding of the universe. The ceremony was held on Earth in the Grand Hall of the Colonial Council. Representatives from every human world attended. When Keisha walked on stage to accept the medal, the entire audience stood and applauded for 15 minutes. She stood there feeling overwhelmed by the moment. In her acceptance speech, she talked about her journey. She did not hide the difficult parts. She spoke about the cabin in the cold and Linda's cruelty. She spoke about Victor's kindness and how it had saved her life. She spoke about the responsibility that came with success. She urged other scientists to use their knowledge for good. She reminded everyone that intelligence without compassion was empty. She finished by saying that the greatest discoveries were not about understanding the universe, but about understanding each other. After the ceremony, Keisha stood alone for a moment in a quiet hallway. She thought about that 12-year-old girl freezing in a cabin, that girl who had been convinced she was worthless and forgotten. If that girl could see what she had become, what she had accomplished, what she had built, Keisha hoped that girl would be proud. She hoped that girl would know that the suffering had meaning because it had taught her compassion. And compassion was what separated humans from machines. It was what gave life purpose. Keisha returned to New Seattle the next day. There was work waiting. There always was. A new expedition to plan. A new batch of scholarship applications to review. A meeting with the foundation board. But she did not mind. This was her life, and she had chosen it freely. She was no longer that abandoned child. She was someone who had taken her pain and transformed it into something beautiful, and she would keep doing that for as long as she lived. The years between 50 and 60 passed with the same intensity that had marked Keisha's entire adult life. She continued to push boundaries in xenotechnology research, making discoveries that opened new possibilities for human expansion. Her team developed better propulsion systems that could cross vast distances more quickly. They created habitat technologies that made it possible to live on worlds that had once been considered uninhabitable. They found ways to communicate across the galaxy almost instantaneously, using principles adapted from architect devices. But the work that gave Keisha the most satisfaction was not the scientific breakthroughs. It was watching the young people from the foundation grow and succeed. Every year, hundreds of students graduated and went out into the world. They became doctors and engineers and teachers and leaders. They took the chances they had been given and used them to help others. The cycle of transformation continued, spreading outward like ripples on water. Arya had taken on more and more responsibility at the institute. She was leading her own research projects now and mentoring younger scientists. Keisha watched her with pride, seeing in Arya the same determination and compassion that Victor had seen in her all those years ago. The relationship between them had evolved from mentor and student to something more like sisters. They understood each other in ways that few people could. At 55, Keisha was invited to give a series of lectures at universities across human space. She spent 6 months traveling from world to world speaking to students about science and ethics and the importance of using knowledge for good. Everywhere she went, the auditoriums were packed. Young people especially connected with her story. She was proof that your beginning did not determine your ending. That transformation was possible for anyone willing to work for it. One of the lectures was at a small college on a frontier world where most of the students came from difficult backgrounds. After her talk, a young woman approached her. She was maybe 19 with scars on her arms that spoke of a hard life. She told Keisha that she had been planning to drop out of school because she did not think she belonged there. But hearing Keisha's story had changed her mind. If you could survive what you survived and accomplish what you accomplished, then maybe I can finish my degree. Keisha spent an hour talking with the young woman. She learned that her name was Sophie, and that she had grown up in foster care bouncing between homes where no one wanted her. She was studying environmental science, hoping to help terraform new worlds. Keisha gave her a scholarship on the spot and put her in contact with people at the institute who could mentor her. 2 years later, Sophie published a paper on atmospheric modification that won prizes. She sent Keisha a copy with a note that said, "Thank you for believing in me." Stories like Sophie's reminded Keisha why the foundation mattered. The work was never done. There would always be more children who needed help, more young people who deserved chances, more lives that could be transformed. And as long as she had breath in her body, Keisha would keep fighting for them. But at 60, Keisha began to feel her age in ways she had not before. The long hours in the lab started to tire her more. The constant travel became exhausting. She found herself thinking more about mortality and legacy. What would happen to everything she had built when she was gone? She had successors in place, but would they carry on the vision? Would they remember that science was a means, not an end? That helping people was what truly mattered? She decided it was time to write a book. Not a scientific treatise, but a memoir. She wanted to document her journey from the cabin to the stars, not for her own glory, but as a guide for others. She wanted young people to read it and understand that their circumstances did not define them. That kindness could change everything. That one person really could make a difference if they were willing to try. Writing the book was harder than any scientific paper. She had to relive painful memories. The cold of the cabin, the years of abuse from Linda, the loss of her mother, but she also got to remember the good things. Victor's kindness, her mother's love of science, the moment when the wormhole opened for the first time. All of it went into the book. She wrote honestly about her failures as well as her successes, about the times she had been wrong, about the mistakes she had made. She wanted people to see that being human meant being flawed. The book was published when Keisha was 62, and it became an immediate success. Millions of copies were sold across the colonies. It was translated into every major language. Schools started using it in their curriculum. Young people wrote to Keisha telling her how the book had inspired them. Some of the letters made her cry. Reading about how her story had given someone hope or courage or the strength to keep going was more rewarding than any scientific prize. Around this time, humanity made contact with another intelligent species. They were not the architects, but a different civilization that had also found architect technology and learned to use it. They called themselves the Harmony, and they were peaceful explorers, much like humans hope to be. The first contact was cautious but friendly. Both species had much to learn from each other. Keisha was part of the delegation that traveled to meet the Harmony. It was strange and wonderful to stand face to face with beings from another world. They looked nothing like humans, but they communicated through a combination of sound and light that could be translated. The Harmony were fascinated by human technology and culture. They shared their own discoveries and knowledge freely. It was the beginning of what everyone hoped would be a lasting friendship between species. Working with the Harmony opened new avenues of research. They had studied the architects from a different angle and had insights that humans had missed. Together, the two species made breakthroughs that neither could have achieved alone. Keisha found it deeply satisfying. This was what the future should look like. Different peoples working together for the common good, learning from each other, building something better than either could create alone. At 65, Keisha stepped back from day-to-day management of the institute. Arya took over as director while Keisha became a senior advisor. She still worked on research projects, but at her own pace. She had more time to spend with people she cared about, more time to simply enjoy life. She traveled not for work but for pleasure, visiting the beautiful worlds that humans and harmony were exploring together. She also spent time reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey from that terrified child to this place had been long and difficult. There had been pain and loss along the way, but there had also been joy and love and accomplishment. She had helped push humanity forward. She had saved lives and changed lives. She had proven that one person with determination and support could move mountains. On the 43rd anniversary of the day Victor had found her in the cabin, Keisha took a private shuttle to New Alaska. The cabin was still there, preserved now as a historical site. People came to visit it to see where the famous Keisha Wallace had almost died. She walked inside and stood in the corner where she had huddled all those years ago. The place was warmer now with heating installed for tourists, but she could still remember the cold. She stood there for a long time thinking about the girl she had been. That girl had been so scared, so alone, so convinced that no one cared whether she lived or died. Keisha wished she could go back and tell that girl what was coming. That rescue was on its way, that she would survive and thrive, that she would do things that seemed impossible. But maybe it was better that the girl had not known. Maybe the not knowing had been part of what made her strong. As she left the cabin and walked back to her shuttle, Keisha felt at peace. She had come full circle, from this place of darkness to a life filled with light, and she had used that light to illuminate the path for others. That was enough. That was everything. She looked up at the sky where stars were beginning to appear in the fading daylight. Humanity was out there among those stars building a future, and she had helped make that possible. At 70, Keisha Wallace stood in the same study where she had spent so many evenings with Victor decades ago. The house was hers now, along with everything else Victor had left her. She had kept the room exactly as it had been. The same furniture, the same view of Puget Sound through the windows. Sometimes when she sat in Victor's old chair, she could almost feel his presence. The gentle guidance, the quiet wisdom, the absolute faith that she could become something extraordinary. Outside the world had changed in ways that would have seemed like fantasy to that 12-year-old girl in the cabin. Humans now lived on hundreds of worlds across dozens of star systems. The Harmony had become close allies, and there were rumors of other species waiting to be discovered. Technology had advanced to levels that blurred the line between science and magic. Disease had been largely conquered. Poverty, while not eliminated, had been greatly reduced. It was not a perfect world, but it was better, much better, and Keisha had played her part in making that happen. The wormhole technology she had unlocked had transformed everything. The foundation she had built had helped tens of thousands of young people. The advocacy work had pushed humanity toward greater equality and justice. She had lived a life that mattered, a life that had made a difference. As she looked back across the decades, she felt satisfied. Not perfect. There had been failures and regrets, but on balance she had done more good than harm. Today was a special day. The Wallace Foundation was celebrating its 50th anniversary. There would be a ceremony at the foundation headquarters with speeches and awards and hundreds of people. Keisha had been asked to give the keynote address. She had spent the last week thinking about what to say, how to sum up 50 years of work, how to inspire the next generation to carry on the mission, how to say goodbye because at 70 she knew her time was growing short. The ceremony hall was packed when Keisha arrived. She saw familiar faces. Arya, who was now 50 and had done extraordinary work continuing Keisha's scientific legacy. Carlos, whose inventions had saved countless lives. Sophie, who had become one of the leading experts on terraforming. Hundreds of others whose lives had been touched by the foundation. Some she knew personally, others she knew only from their files. But all of them were connected by the simple fact that someone had given them a chance when they needed it. When it was time for her speech, Keisha walked slowly to the stage. Her body was not what it had been. Age had brought aches and pains and a certain fragility, but her mind was still sharp and her voice was still strong. She looked out at the audience and felt a wave of emotion. These were her people, her family in the truest sense, connected not by blood but by shared values and mutual support. She began by telling them about the cabin. Even after all these years, the story had power. She described the cold and the fear and the certainty that she was going to die. She talked about Linda's cruelty and how racism and hatred had nearly killed her. Some people in the audience were hearing this for the first time. Others had heard it before, but it still moved them. Keisha saw tears on many faces. She felt tears on her own. Then she talked about Victor, about how one person's choice to investigate an anomaly had changed everything, about how his kindness and generosity had given her a future, about how he had believed in her when she did not believe in herself. She wished Victor could be here to see what his investment had grown into, but she thought he would be proud. She hoped he would be proud. "I stand before you today," she said, "not as someone special or extraordinary, but as living proof of what is possible when we help each other. I was nothing, a disposable child that my stepmother threw away like trash, but Victor saw value where others saw none, and that changed everything. Not just for me, but for all of you, and for the thousands of people you have helped in turn. That is the power of compassion. That is why we do this work." She talked about the Foundation's mission, about finding young people with potential and giving them the resources to succeed, about breaking down barriers and fighting discrimination, about using science and technology to improve lives rather than just accumulate wealth. She talked about the architects and the lesson of their fall, that knowledge without wisdom led to destruction, that progress meant nothing if it was not shared by everyone. Looking forward, she said, the work is not done. There are still children suffering, still people being left behind, still injustices that need to be fought. I will not be here forever. Sooner than I would like, my time will end. But the Foundation will continue. The mission will continue, because it is not about me. It has never been about me. It is about all of us choosing to be better, choosing to help rather than hurt, choosing to build rather than destroy. She finished by making a promise. As long as I have breath, I will keep fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. And when I am gone, I trust that you will carry on, that you will remember what we learned together, that transformation is possible, that kindness matters, that every single person has value and deserves a chance. Do not let the darkness win. Keep building the light. The applause that followed was thunderous. People stood and clapped, and some were openly weeping. Keisha stood there taking it in, feeling the love and respect wash over her. After the ceremony, people came up to thank her, to tell her what the Foundation had meant to them, to share their own stories of transformation. Keisha listened to each person, giving them her full attention. This was what mattered. Not the fame or the awards, but these connections, these lives that had been changed for the better. This web of compassion spreading outward, touching more people every day. Late that night, Keisha returned home. She was exhausted, but in a good way, the kind of tired that came from meaningful work. She poured herself a glass of wine and went to the study. She stood at the window looking out at the water. The moon was full and it cast a silver path across the sound. In the distance, she could see the lights of shuttles heading to orbit. People going about their lives, living and loving and working. All of it made possible by the technologies she had helped unlock. She thought about her journey, from darkness to light, from powerlessness to influence, from victim to victor. It had not been easy. There had been pain and loss and struggle, but there had also been joy and love and the deep satisfaction of knowing she had made the world better. She had survived when survival seemed impossible. She had thrived when others expected her to fail. She had become someone who mattered, someone who helped, someone who gave others the chances she had received. Keisha raised her glass to the window. To Victor, she said softly, "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for showing me what was possible." She felt his presence then. Not literally, but in spirit. The lessons he had taught her. The values he had instilled. The example he had set. All of it lived on in her and in everyone she had helped. That was immortality. Not living forever, but leaving behind something that mattered. She thought about her mother, Amara, who had died so long ago. Her mother had taught her to love science and learning, had shown her that knowledge was power, had believed her daughter could be something special. Keisha had proved her mother right. She had taken that early foundation and built something magnificent. She hoped her mother was somewhere watching, proud of what her daughter had become, and she thought about Linda, the woman who had tried to kill her, who had hated her for the color of her skin, who had nearly succeeded in ending her life before it truly began. Keisha felt no hatred anymore, only pity. Linda had been consumed by her own darkness. She had died alone and unmourned. She had wasted her life on cruelty when she could have chosen kindness. That was punishment enough. As Keisha prepared for bed that night, she felt at peace. Her life had meaning. Her work would continue. The children who came after her would have opportunities because she had fought for them. That was enough. That was everything. She had been rescued from darkness and had spent her life bringing light to others. The cycle continued. The transformation perpetuated itself. And that was the greatest legacy anyone could leave. In the morning there would be more work. More challenges. More young people to help. But tonight Keisha could rest knowing that she had lived well. That she had used her gifts wisely. That she had made Victor's investment worthwhile. That she had honored her mother's memory. That she had proved that one person really could change the world. Not through grand gestures or dramatic acts, but through steady, consistent kindness and the refusal to give up on people that others had written off. The story that had started in a freezing cabin with a terrified child had become a tale of hope and transformation that would be told for generations. Not because Keisha was special, but because she was human, flawed and frightened and determined, capable of suffering but also of overcoming, able to take pain and transform it into purpose. That was the real message. Not that Keisha Wallace was extraordinary, but that everyone had that potential within them. Everyone could choose to be better. Everyone could help others. Everyone could make a difference. And somewhere out there among the stars, a child was suffering tonight. Alone and scared and convinced that no one cared. But maybe tomorrow someone would find them. Someone would give them a chance. Someone would show them kindness.